everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. As always, I'm your host, Greg, and with me is my lovely co-host, Mark.
Hello, everyone. Happy Halloween month.
Yeah, happy spooky October.
Yeah, I wish those
accordance with
combined well. Spooktober.
Spooktober. Yeah, there's no way to make that like spoopy really easily anyway. But I will say one odd thing was that spiders have reappeared in my apartment and right outside my door, which is
Ooh,
plenty spoopy,
so
actually.
thematic.
Yeah, I know, isn't it? It's like naturally. I actually hadn't put that together until right now that those started right at the beginning of October. We'd had this horrible. There's this kind of awning. I live on the first floor, and there's tons of areas for spider webs. And actually, there's one point in early summer, late spring, when like particularly our door, there was a spider that would build an entire like a beautiful giant web across our door every morning, like right at head height, and
Okay.
and so we'd have to remember to duck basically as we left or to destroy it in the morning, and there were just dozens. There were like a lot of like large spiders just surrounding my apartment to the walkway, and and so we finally like called maintenance, and we're like, can you like get rid of can we like not live in Shelob's lair? And they were like, yeah. So they came out and like sprayed something, and then it was fine for months through like the whole summer. And eventually, actually, it literally took me like a couple weeks to like stop ducking when I left my apartment, like naturally, like I'd
Interesting.
coded that in. And then the spiders have been reappearing, so they're back.
Right.
Um, it's weirdly warm here in the Midwest for this time of year. It was like in the 80s yesterday, and
Oh,
is
wow.
the mid 70s again today. So
I always feel like it is also warm here in Florida, but that's not as weird, I guess. I do feel
yeah,
like coldness makes Halloween scarier.
totally.
And that actually ties into what we're going to be talking about today
Ooh,
because there's an increased element of survival when it's cold.
that wasn't even
Because
planned, folks. That's just Mark Bishop.
when it's cold, you being outside is not a steady state, right? Unless you've brought special gear, you can't just live outside.
That's a really good point.
You have to plan your route between places that are survivable, where you can just hang out.
Right,
Um, because if it's 40, 50 degrees outside, you can't just, again, I already said this, but you can't just stay out there.
right.
And that actually kicks off what we're talking about today, which is death and survival. And those two are very interrelated, and we'll tease that out a little bit more as the episode goes on.
In video games, just to be clear, we haven't just face heel turned all the way into just straight philosophy yet. It might be where eventually we end up, but but yeah, no. So last
That's
week we were
right.
trying to do like fear and expectation and how games mess with you in that way. This week we were thinking, so we actually did do a playthrough of a game that is up on Twitch and YouTube. That was not what we were hoping yet, at least. I won't spoil too much because I think we're gonna finish the game this week and then hopefully have something to
Yeah.
talk about next week. But the original plan was to talk about that this week, and we
There's not
didn't
that much
actually
to talk about.
get anything to talk about out of 2.5 hours of gameplay. Amazingly, so it is funny at least to watch us slowly go insane. It was a different kind of horror, really, because we were playing Doki Doki Literature Club, and
That's right.
but anyways, the point is, we so for this week we're trying to figure out what to do, and one thing that we did talk about last week, as well as I was reading some articles this week and just was thinking about, was one of the big, the huge thing in most horror, just in general, is like fear of death, right? We can all kind of agree that is like the baseline thing that humans fear, probably more than anything, and
Right.
so that's where most horror really gets its power in one way or another, right? And so the one thing that differentiates games specifically from any other type of horror is that outside of the interaction that we've talked about too, another thing with games, which is usually actually even referenced in media. I think of the line, Eminem's line from uh, "Love the Way You Lie," that life is no Nintendo game because you don't get another try. Um, which is the ability to die and restart. That's just like coded into every game ever. Otherwise,
Right. It's just like a cheap way of, okay, it's not cheap, but it's a really common way to just sort of have the ending, right?
right,
Like like a stand-in
Some
for
fail
like,
state.
okay, yeah, like you failed, you need to try that again. So what we're gonna do is kill your character, and then it's like that's like the universal like signal that things are done there.
Right,
Like
and because in
you know
games
that nothing.
usually, yeah, sorry. So games are like fantasy based, right? Usually, so like usually they're far more extreme. So when you fail something, like fail states exist in real life, right? Like I've failed at many things, um, but I haven't died yet because I don't tend to be in a
Really?
place where a fail will actually mean my death. That's probably happened a few times, but very very rare. Other than driving, but that's a weird thing. Point is, in games, usually it's not fun to just play normal life. So you're doing extreme things, or if you do fail, if you miss a jump, then you will die, right? So the most common fail state is death. So, and that's fine. That's actually really fine in most games, particularly action games and combat games in general. Where that doesn't work, actually, is horror.
Which is really
Because,
ironic,
right, isn't that
because you would,
ironic?
yeah, you would think that like you associate horror movies and things like that with having a lot more death than your average, or like a lot more, at
Yeah,
least the
yeah,
topic matter relates to death more
right.
so than another genre.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in a game though, if you and we'll talk. This is what this show's about today. So we'll tease this out. But in general, if you die too much death actually gets less and less scary. As the player, at least. If you see other things die, then that obviously you can play into that being scary. But in general, death as a failure point begins to steal the fear from the game, particularly in terms of if that ultimate idea is to avoid death and you die, and you realize, hey, I didn't. I'm still here, right? As a player, like I'm not this. This is survivable. This is doable as a person. Um, then
Right.
suddenly the big, huge point of the game loses its really core. Uh, it'd be like if in like a I don't know, like in a fighter, if like you I don't know, the better you fought, the less damage you did in a way, right? Like the core
Mm.
combat or the core mechanic of the game being fear of death gets co-opted by the fact that it happens. If you actually
Right. Yeah.
succeed at
If
the
like
thing that the game is trying to make you do, which is in theory to like get that ultimate scare of death, then eventually that's not going to work anymore.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's just it totally destroys the engine of the game. Like that is the driving force.
Mm.
Whereas like an RPG, it might be to increase your skill. Like imagine if while you were leveling in an RPG, the enemies always got better faster than you did.
Right? Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it
that's a good
would
one.
just be like
Yeah,
the
you'd stop playing
worst.
that RPG. No, you're exactly right. That's exactly the reason you're playing that game is completely lost. And the
Exactly.
game is sabotaging it. So that got us thinking about just so what looking at games, horror games particularly, and how they handle death and how what are some alternatives to that? What games can take away other than your life to be scary and particularly so obviously the best genre with this was kind of survival horror, right? Combat horror like Fear or Dead Space are a little bit different, where the fear of death isn't. Dead Space is a little bit unique, and we'll get there. But um, particularly the survival horror genre, where the whole game is just based around survival.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. So the interesting, let's start talking just about like the kind of the core part of survival horror being like resources and resource management.
Sure. Yeah, so I actually want to take just a second. We like to do differentiations on this podcast.
Mhm.
So there are games which are survival and not horror.
Yes,
So
yep,
and
that's a good point.
those and what characterizes a survival game is resource management and the sense of there like always being pressure on you, the player. You can't, again, it's sort of like being outside when it's 40 degrees out. Like it's not, there's something about the game that makes it so that you can't really find a steady state.
Right.
Like you
Yeah.
can't really get your footing. You have to go forward,
Always
and
one step
the
behind.
game really pressures you forward. If you think about board games, games like where you're against the game, like Pandemic, Shadows
Right.
over Camelot,
Right.
like Hidden Island, Hidden Desert, those games. Again, there's always this like, man, until we're done with the game, like it's a sprint
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's always bad things happening.
Yeah.
In terms of video games, Oregon Trail is one I could think of where
Mhm.
it's like it's not a horror game. It's actually so often that survival games are horror games. It was hard for me to think of an
I
example.
like Don't
But
Starve.
yeah, even that has like some dark themes to it. But
That's
yeah,
true.
Don't Starve would be a survival game.
There's another one. It was kind of like an RTS. It was like what was it called? I remember seeing Day Nine play it. Um, it's kind of like a you get exile. It's kind of like a classic like pilgrim thing where you get exiled and you're in this new land and you only have like 5 villagers and you have to basically build a town. Um,
Interesting.
and the primary mechanic, as opposed to kind of like an RTS where you have like enough resources, is like making sure they have enough food for the winter. It's seasonal, uh,
Hmm.
and like making sure that you're kind of dwarf fortress esque, I suppose, in some ways. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
uh, there's no combat or enemies. I think there might be wild animals, but in general, it's just trying to get make the right decisions on a macro level to ensure your survival as a group. Um,
Right. And so in those games, you're always having to manage your resources and watch, what you're spending very closely, because
right.
if you don't, then you won't survive, and
Yeah.
that's really the point of these survival games. It isn't really. It's very disempowering, unlike a typical video game where you
Mm-hmm.
really, you accrue. You've got a whole inventory full of items you never use because you're waiting for that one perfect moment and it never comes, and you're just like the super badass that goes around and kills
Right. It's
things.
the
Like
exact opposite.
Diablo 3 is the opposite of a survival game.
That is,
Like
yeah, that is accurate. That is,
you are almost unstoppable. You can mow down hordes of enemies with
or actually literally a
nothing but
god
your
almost. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, you're a Nephilim, and so that disempowering feel is, I think, why it matches so well with horror, and
Right.
why it leads into those fantasies really well. Is because when you're disempowered, you feel vulnerable, and vulnerability is a prerequisite to fear, right? If you're invulnerable, there's nothing to be afraid of. And so that actually it makes me think of
That's another point
Diablo.
there,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah.
yeah, right. Diablo. Well, it
Jumping.
makes me think of Diablo and 3, and maybe why that wasn't so scary. But
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point actually.
just
That
it's not
one
disempowering
large.
at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, that's probably another
We've
episode. But
beaten God Diablo 3. We already went through the like
I know.
horse metaphor. So
Uh,
but no,
so going back to
that actually made me think
survival
of
horror.
your topic we'll get to a little bit later, but talking about when you other things you can do to punish a player other than death,
Right.
which is an interesting idea. But point is, keep on going.
Yeah. So survival horror is going to make you manage resources to stay alive, but the pressure that the game exerts on you also includes like this fear and this sense of being terrorized by the external environment.
Right.
Like the environment is less passive than like in you could say that trying to survive outside when it's 40 degrees is a sort of survival, but like now if I put you in the forest and there's a bunch of like wild animals looking for food, who are coming and harassing you.
Right.
Okay, now that's a little, now we're getting closer to horror territory. If
Right.
I put you in like a cemetery full of like, people who are wanting to mug you and take your things, okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like when the environment becomes more threatening, then you really get more into the horror part of it, because you're not just vulnerable, but you actually also have things preying on you.
That's a great differentiation. That's excellent. And that's exactly what very often the top kind of like survival horror games are very often praised for their ambiance, for their setting being kind of a character in of itself, right? You
Right.
hear like even like Bioshock, which isn't has horror elements. We talked about that last week a little bit, but Rapture, the area you're in, this underground utopia that has fallen into just the depths of depravity, is a character in and of itself, in terms of the way you interact with it. Amnesia and the mansion and the dungeon, as you continually go deeper and deeper into it, is really the only, in large part with Amnesia actually. There's only like there's one monster basically that you can see at any point, and there's
Right.
no other characters to interact with in the entire game. It's all retroactive. You're all remembering things. So it's almost literally the only other character other than yourself, which is first person, is the mansion. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Outlast, to an extent. The setting of the very first thing that you do when you get into that game is you drive up to the mansion, to the asylum, and the whole point of the beginning is actually just to get into the asylum. The only thing you're interacting with is this building.
Right.
Um, oh yeah, Silent Hill is a perfect. I mean that's kind of pioneered this in some ways, which is ironic actually, because you know this story, Mark. The One of the most famous parts of Silent Hill is like kind of the fog that covers the town when you're
Mm-hmm.
there, and that's become a staple of those games. That basically you get trapped in this, you know, kind of hellish subdimension. You're kind of outside of space and time, and and the way that the game represented that was through this fog that settles on the town, and you can't get out basically. And had
Hmm.
this great feeling of just claustrophobia and unknown and otherness, that you're very desperately alone and hopeless. And the original reason for that was, of course, hardware constraints back in the day
Right.
for the original Silent Hill, which was they couldn't render. They couldn't make the area scary enough by rendering things, because that would require too much computing power. So they just, instead of like cutting off, like normal games in that time would have just kind of like cut off and the environment will like rebuild as you walk. Um,
Right.
they just added what was already there, which was just fog, and then had the world build in the fog, which is kind of what that would look like anyway as you walk through fog.
Right. They
So it
they
was,
just turn down the viewing distance,
yeah,
basically.
basically,
Like what you
yeah,
could do the same thing in like almost any first-person shooter,
yeah,
which is really funny.
yeah. So that's because that's a very often talked about staple of the Silent Hill series, and was just a large part of fluke. So, but anyway, all that's to say, yeah. So the environment is what separates out, you think, survival from survival horror. Something preying upon weakness as opposed to just the experience of weakness.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And so obviously, like resource management in Outlast, you had the batteries in your like night vision camera.
Mm-hmm.
In Amnesia, you've got torches. It's interesting actually to think about how often these
Ah, so those are both
resources.
light
Uh,
based, aren't they?
yeah, really. Well, so is the Silent Hill one. It's all vision based, right?
Yeah.
It's like a way. It's a way to see more,
Huh.
and so
Interesting.
the resource that you're managing in those games is like the ability to make things less scary.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you have a
To
limited
uncover.
amount of way. Yeah, one way to protect yourself, one way to not feel as vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because if I have a night vision camera, then I don't feel as vulnerable in the dark. Or if I
Yeah.
have a torch,
Yeah.
in
Exactly.
Silent Hill, they have torches. I'm not sure. Can they run out in Silent Hill?
I don't know. I've actually never played a Silent Hill game. I've watched part of two,
Okay.
which is kind of the most famous, and I've read a lot about them, but I never played. I was when those were big. I was young, and there's like no way I was touching that crap. So
Yeah, fair.
yeah.
Uh, but I think that that's not uncommon. I know in a game like Dead Space, the resources there's still resource management.
Hmm.
It isn't as directly related to like trying to reduce the horror in the game,
Right.
whereas with
Right.
the previously two mentioned games, like that is really the only thing you have to manage is
Yeah.
like the amount of fear happening.
Yeah, which is really interesting because that's the exact, like you said, that's kind of like the only thing those games have. Like last week we talked about expectation and that being the root of those games' fear. And if as long as you have that darkness does that, right? It heightens expectation while
Hmm.
also hiding what is in it. So
Right.
you still having that continual experience of not knowing what's coming, but knowing that it could be bad,
Hmm.
where that walks that kind of little middle line we talked about last week of not being totally unknowable, but also so any mechanic that allows you to pierce that a little bit, makes sense that that would be the thing that would be empowering or be able to reduce the fear a little bit. Amnesia even takes that a little one step further, which is you have a lantern that you can find oil for, and that just drains like the battery. You also just have little environmental candles, and you have flint boxes, and if you find one, you can just spend one flint box to light one thing, and then that's a permanent light right there. Um, which I think is really cool because that it combines. You can basically light. Um, feels like a safe space in Amnesia, right? And you by lighting, the only permanent source of light is something that you light with a flint box, right? And so by doing that, you suddenly, and it's immobile, you can't pick it up and take it with you. So when you're there, you feel like you have this little oasis for like a second, or 10 seconds, however long you want to spend in that area. And then the game forces you, if you want to progress, the game forces you to leave that safety, forces you to jump into something from the known and safe into the unsafe. And that moment of being safe and having to choose to be unsafe is what makes horror games so much more horrible to me than uh, movies or
Or
books,
movies. Right.
um, because you have to make that decision. You are making the active decision to put yourself in danger, which is actually very difficult, uh, obviously. But anyway, the point is, Amnesia. The other thing Amnesia does is with light, even outside of just that natural, like you said, kind of like fear management. Amnesia has, if you're in the darkness for too long, the game actually makes itself scarier. So you have like kind of this unseen sanity meter that if you're in the darkness goes down, if you're in light, then it will increase. And if you have full sanity, then everything's fine. And I mean, it's still horrifying, but it's normal at least. And as sanity decreases, you begin to hallucinate more. The camera will blur itself a little bit. The sound effects are really important too. You'll hear skitterings and noises that you can't really tell if are real or not. You'll begin to, if it gets really bad, you'll begin to see bugs, and I think actually enemies will appear, and that's actually worse. You can't die of complete insanity uh, in that game. So that's an interesting. It's cool. That's why that system works probably, is because it taps into that kind of unseen system that Mark was talking about, and just reinforces it. That yeah, if the less you know, the worse things are going to get, and the potential for things being bad gets higher and higher.
It really
So
amplifies that too with the insanity system,
exactly.
because it's like it's not even like, well, you don't know what's out there, but like actually your mind starts to add things that aren't out there,
Yeah, yeah,
which happens just as a player. Like
right,
normally, that's what makes being in a dark room in a horror game
right.
scary, is because you've
You're
added the expectation that like something bad is right around the corner. But then when the game is literally doing that for you, like it's obviously even worse.
Yeah, yeah. Which is, I mean, people often talk about the Dark Descent. There's two, technically Amnesia. There's two games. There's Amnesia Dark Descent, and then Amnesia Machine for Pigs. But when I say Amnesia, I'm always talking about the Dark Descent, which I think everyone thinks about. Um, but the Dark Descent is, I mean, usually considered one of the just pinnacles of horror games of the past. I mean, really ever. And it's cool that even two podcasting hacks can kind of identify some cool things about fear, and then we're like, oh yeah, and Amnesia does that naturally and supplements it.
Right,
Like
right.
I think it's a masterclass of game design in a lot of ways, particularly the survival side of it. So one thing, so for as good as Amnesia is, one thing I also wanted to mention is, and we talked about this a little bit last week, but just in general, survival horror is actually difficult. I maintain I think it's a pretty difficult thing to keep up indefinitely, particularly in terms of the feelings of, so the resource management part of it, I think, is tailored. Mark, you pointed this out well. It's tailored really well to, you can keep that up for a really long time actually, and the longer you keep that going, the more stressful it gets.
Right.
Um, so I think that element is really good. You never get, unless the game really messes up its balance. You never, in Amnesia, you're always stressed about light. At no point do you have
Yeah.
enough flint boxes or oil. You never feel comfortable there.
Which is an interesting, I mean, this is a little bit of an aside to your point, but
Mm.
like it gives you something so that it can take it away. Like,
Yeah,
and in that way, increase your stress as a player. Like, if you just would have never had light, that may have worn off quicker.
you'd
Like,
adapt. Yeah,
yeah, you'd
that's a good
adapt to
point.
the darkness, but because in Outlast and Amnesia, you're always looking for that next thing that you can use to try to dispel the fear.
Yeah,
It like that
it
mechanic
becomes a stress
itself
by itself.
becomes a stress itself
Yeah,
and may actually make the fear worse, which
yeah.
is really ironic.
That's absolutely fascinating. That's a great point, man. That actually compounds upon itself.
Right.
You're adding something.
Be,
That's really interesting. Because like think about like um oh crap, I just totally lost my thought. That's all right. Um, where I was going with the amnesia part, at least the discussion, more or less, was that and this will actually tie into a little bit with death as well. That the once you've seen kind of all of a uh, part of the, I'm so sorry. Are you trying to signal something to me?
no.
Oh, okay. You're just playing right. Okay. I thought you were like highlighting. We have a Google Doc that we
Oh,
share.
oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah,
It's
that's
fine.
distracting, isn't it?
Well, I was on the
No.
doc and I was like, "Are you trying to make me talk about this?" He kept on highlighting something over and over on the shared Google Doc. I was like,
All
"You're fine."
right. Yeah, shouldn't do that. Forgot you
Yeah.
could see that.
No,
Okay.
if you can do that now. I don't find it's fine as long as I know you're not trying to like desperately signal me to stop talking about something. Anyway,
No.
all I was saying was that it gets difficult when, and it's similar to death, which is once you've seen kind of everything that amnesia has to throw at you, The resource management is still stressful, but the scares, the expectation, once you finally have a really good idea of all the expectation in that game, suddenly it's actually far less scary. And you'll see this if you watch like Let's Plays towards the end of the game, which also that code kind of coincides with the fact that it is like a hard puzzle game too.
Right.
And you begin focusing more on the puzzles and less on the fear. And the end is actually the hardest puzzle. So towards the end, people really aren't scared anymore. In large part, the fear is pretty much gone. It's also a long game, and you tend to see horror games be pretty short in general. So that's another interesting thing, that in general you never lose the stress of those games, in terms of the management part. Like I said, like you're never feel good about the amount of as opposed to like, like think of like any other game. Like I'm a hoarder, right? Like in an RPG, and I'll have like
Right.
all my potions and abilities that I never use until the last boss, and then I'll beat the last boss and never use them. Like horror games don't do that. Like you will use every there's no, it punishes you directly for hoarding in a horror game, right? Like there's no point in having 5 batteries and not using, like, I'll use my night vision for the next room. Like f that. Like it
Yeah.
actually, you will immediately begin using your resources, which is I think it's a cool thing. Yeah.
And I would say most games, most survival horror games that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years, will regulate the amount of resources they give you based on what you already have. And
Yeah, that's
we've
true.
talked
That's a good
about
point.
Left 4 Dead and how they. I don't know that they pioneered that, but they're definitely like one of
I
the
gotta be
first
close to that,
notable
man.
examples. Yeah, they got to
Yeah.
be close to pioneering
The
that.
first one?
But I know, I'm pretty sure that Outlast does only give you batteries when you're running low, because that's the only time I ever found a
Yep.
battery was when I
Yep.
was almost out of battery.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the exact thing we've been talking about, right? With the survival, the continually gimping your character, and I obviously, like, even in terms of, Outlast says it outright, like run, hide, don't bother fighting.
Right.
But that was something that people talked about. Amnesia was at a time when Dark Descent came out, horror was a lot more action based. Like there was, uh, I mean, Fear was big in that time period, and then Dead Space, which is more combat based. And Amnesia was unique in that you had absolutely no combat, right? And
Right.
that's a very, very powerless feeling, similar to other kind of like Slender, right? Which is a really tiny game. I think this was called the Nine Notes. I think you just have to. I think that's the subtitle.
Yeah, you just
Uh,
you just have to find 9 notes. Yeah, it's
yeah,
really
yeah,
easy, really
yeah. It's a
straightforward.
very, very simple game. But you want to
uh,
talk about, right before we move on to death and kind of the way that death begins to interact with these things. We want to talk about a little bit about Darkest Dungeon. Just
yeah. Well,
and
so
the atmosphere there.
that game like struck me while I was we were talking about survival, because it sort of toes the line between survival and survival horror. Like it is
Yep.
definitely a survival game. Like your heroes are always being driven insane. You have to put them in sanitarium so that they can recover. They're getting poisoned. They're getting paranoid. Your light's burning out. Like there's so many resources that are being drawn upon whenever you do anything in that game.
Really?
And whenever I
That's cool.
played it, I never felt like, oh, I'm like in a good position right now. I'm probably fine.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it always feels like
Barely
you're just
surviving.
waiting for the other shoe to drop always,
Yeah.
and that is a really cool thing to see in an RPG like Darkest Dungeon,
Yeah.
because in RPGs I for better or worse usually end up grinding a little bit and getting a
Right.
little over leveled and feeling pretty good about what's happening during the game,
Yeah.
but in Darkest Dungeon you can't really do that.
Yeah. That's an
It,
interesting. It's a horror RPG, which we haven't really come across too much.
Yeah, they're pretty
Right.
uncommon, and so I put it between like survival horror and survival, because like it's definitely a dark game. All the themes are dark, all the
Right.
setting is the atmosphere is dark, but it's not like, there's no jump scares in Darkest
Right.
Dungeon. Like it's
Right.
more just atmospherically dark, and so it didn't necessarily seem to fit in with the likes of like Outlast and Silent Hill, which
Right.
is a bit more visceral, I would say, than Darkest Dungeon is a bit more atmospheric. So,
Right.
uh,
Exactly.
I
Absolutely.
and I think that's a great example of like the atmosphere, the level being kind of its own entity and opposing you,
Totally.
because yeah, the backstory to Darkest Dungeon is that you've inherited this mansion where people have, they found a dungeon underneath the mansion, and it basically ruined the mansion and all the buildings around it, like all the houses.
Right.
You're kind of like this big mansion on a hill in this feudal system where you've got these other little and buildings around you who support you, and that whole system has been driven insane by whatever's happening in this dungeon. And so everything that's happening feels oppressive, feels like it's opposing you. And I guess, yeah, I don't have a major point here other than it fits squarely between survival and survival horror. And it's a cool thing for an RPG to do.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because, like you said, kind of talking about the core like idea behind a horror game versus the core idea behind an RPG, which an RPG is in general, a power trip, an ability to improve and increase and power up and be more than you were at each stage, and
Right.
that's just really interesting, the interaction between that. And so I agree, it's not just kind of straight horror. Actually, reminds me of Dark Souls a little bit in that Dark
Right.
Souls definitely has this incredible feeling of weight and darkness and is very gothic and kind of horror based in a lot of ways, in terms of a lot of weird character models. The world is just absolutely unforgiving, obviously. But wouldn't you? No one calls Dark Souls a horror game necessarily.
Right.
Um, or Bioshock, another good one, right? That's like another RPG,
And
where you are.
it's
And
interesting
it's
that
important to note in. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, neither of these games are like too empowering, right? And I would say Dead Space isn't
Right.
too
I was about to say the
empowering
same thing.
either. And I think that it's really important. You don't have to go that route. A game like the new Doom remake does not go that route. You're very powerful in Doom, but
Yeah.
it has a very different feel than a game uh, Dead Space or
Yeah. Dark
uh,
Souls. Sorry.
Dark Souls,
And I was
because
gonna. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. No, go
I
ahead.
was gonna say the same exact thing, which was basically Dark Souls is similar in that you, at least in my, I have not finished it. I did not get good. But my like 20 plus hours playing, I at no point felt like, all right, like I'm set. Like bring on the next thing.
Yeah.
I was always just like how am I gonna inch my way forward? you know, how am I barely gonna get through the next thing? Same thing with Bioshock. At least on your first playthrough, they do a really good job at scaling. You are always scavenging for ammo, for resources. You have multiple guns, but very often you don't have enough ammo for all of them. So you're going to have to pick which guns you'll even have ammo for. And they scale combat very, very well, in terms of different types of enemies and the big daddy kind of mini bosses that are roaming around. Um, so it's similar where they have these kind of pieces of these, kind of some of the DNA of horror in it in terms of not allowing you to ever feel fully in control or fully, the feeling you have in like, I don't know, Final Fantasy or uh, Shadows of Mordor, Dragon Age, that sort of thing, Skyrim, where you can just walk through things and you
Right.
really feel like you're in a good place and like, all right, now let me see what else the game can throw at me to challenge me. Like you never feel that way in Dark Souls. You're always just like, oh my god, like please let this area be minusculely easier or just not harder
Yeah,
than the last
right.
one.
No,
Like,
exactly. I was going to say there was a point where we were looking for areas that were less challenging. We're like,
yeah, yeah.
okay, which one of these four options can we actually
Yeah,
make it through?
that's where I still am, man. I ended up beating one, but that was a dead end. It was when we could either fight the Hydra, we could go past the Hydra into a tower with a mini boss,
Mhm.
or we could go down to the Valley of the Drakes,
Right, and all three
which we just got.
options were just not great.
Yeah, so we just kept on going.
Or we could kill
That
our
was-
own blacksmith.
yeah, oh, yeah. You weren't there for that, were you?
No, I wasn't.
Oh my god!
Oh,
I was trying to demonstrate. I was trying to demonstrate to Xander, my roommate, that we couldn't. I think that we couldn't aggro him, right? That we could just kill him. And then I did because we had done that when you and I were playing, and I'd hit him a couple times and he didn't aggro. And you're like, all right, cool, be careful, like let's not kill the blacksmith. And I was like,
right.
yeah, no, it's fine. I was showing Xander, and I was like, oh yeah, we can hit him as much as we want. I hit him like I guess one too many times, and he got up and started attacking me. And I
Uh,
ran. I sprinted all the way through the creepy forest of despair, and he followed me. And eventually, I just had to fight him. I killed him, and then I
the
respawned,
blacksmith.
and sure enough,
Hmm.
Got a lot of souls from him. Anyway, I got a
Well,
side tip.
I would the
So
like I think one of the reasons why you're put in the position of being so disempowered in those games is because the whole survival
yeah,
schema, the whole survival atmosphere is really antithetical to the idea of like taking your time to grind.
interesting.
Like like you really can't just like sit there and become more powerful because the whole game is pressuring you forward at a rate that's just slightly faster
It's
than you'd
uncomfortable.
like to
Yeah,
go.
yeah. You
Like
shouldn't be
the
able
whole
to take the
point is
time to
that it's
stop and
yeah,
feel
exactly.
comfortable enough to, or feel safe enough to be like, yeah, I'll engage with these creepy. Like that's actually I had to do that in Dark Souls to get. We were trying to unlock another area. There was a fourth, right? There was that that
Oh,
door
that
in the
door.
woods,
Yeah, the door in
and
the
I did
woods.
grind that, and it was kind of terrifying because at any point, if I screwed up, I was going to lose like five
All the
hours
souls.
of grinding. But so even there, so there is some fear. But you're right. At the same time, it was doable. I found an area that I could do over and over and over again with high efficiency, and I ended up grinding out 20,000 souls and unlocking the door, and then getting murdered immediately upon entering. So that area is off limits too. Um,
Right.
but you're
But
right. In
that
that
mechanic
line
of
is there in other
carrying,
games. Yeah, totally.
but even the mechanic of carrying around the souls with you again kind of puts this pressure on you to like you can't just like save everything for a rainy day, you know.
Yes, yes, yep, precisely. So that level of survival is really what drives these things. So let's talk about survival from what, Mark?
Yes, now that we've talked about survival to death, let's talk about death.
Just dying, yeah. So,
Hey.
as I
Yeah,
said, games need a fail state. That's just absolutely. Otherwise, it's not a game at that point. You are just playing through a. I
movie.
don't know. You're playing Heavy Rain. Lol. Um, nah, there's a few fail states. But you're playing interactive media, I guess is what they call it. So games need fail states. Dying is horrible. So let's just kill you. And in theory, that should be the worst thing, right? You should always want to be avoiding that.
Right.
Let's have a
Well,
guy with a scythe split your dick in half.
oh no.
Is an actual
That's
death
a
in
fail
Resident Evil
state.
7.
Yeah, in case you wanted to see that.
Yeah, you saw that
No, I
drift.
know. I'm just saying to our audience, if you want to, if that's something that you'd like to experience, play Resident
Yeah,
Evil 7.
yeah, exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, all right,
yeah, it's in there
RE7.
for you. Yeah.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, but it seems like it should be sort of this boogeyman in the closet, and for most of human existence, it is. But it doesn't necessarily translate 100% to playing a horror game,
Right.
which we mentioned a little bit earlier.
Just
But
like in real life, if you were able to die and come back, people would not be as scared of death.
yeah, exactly. Like there is some real permanence to death in life.
Right.
There is not permanence to death in a video game, like unless it's gonna melt your computer or something really crazy like that.
Yeah,
It's
right. You'd be scared as shit playing games.
right. There's not a sense of there being something at risk, which is hard to create in games anyway because everything that the player has in the game you created. Like it was
Right.
created as a developer, you created it, you gave it to them.
Didn't have
So
it.
you're just giving things to them so that you can take it away. So you
Yep.
gave them this life in this creepy mansion, and then you can threaten to take that away, but it doesn't have the same weight as when we human beings find ourselves somehow on planet Earth, and then we could die. Like
Right.
we didn't opt into living, and so
Yeah.
death.
Yeah. Right.
Like I think in some ways death
No
feels
controller.
it could make death feel worse because like
For sure.
we didn't make this happen, and we can't really make it unhappen.
Yeah. Precisely. So the so then the question becomes, if death itself, what can happen basically in short is the game a game can devolve into using death as a mechanic basically where you almost can't get through an area without dying and having to learn it, right? It's basically just a trial and error
Right.
game.
I mean, think
And a
about
lot of
like
horror,
Super
survival horror happens.
Super Meat Boy, right? I mean, that's not survival horror, but that is a game where like
Right.
death is a mechanic. Like you
Oh, exactly.
die and you respawn very quickly because the point is you're supposed to try an error.
Yeah, exactly. And that works brilliantly, right? That's actually very very fun to do that. And games that are able to utilize that will make death very very simple or light. And so what unfortunately what happens if a game falls into that design wise, like Last has actually been criticized for this in large part, which was the last scene that Mark and I played, even where we died. It was the first time we could die, and we just died immediately, which is actually talk about in a second. But was you're being chased by someone who wishes violence upon you, to say the least, and you're trying to solve a really simple puzzle and get out, but you don't know the area at all. You just got there. So there's multiple doors that lead to dead ends or places that you can't go. And Outlast had some. There's a hiding mechanic so that you can make a mistake and kind of get out of there. But in large part, and I was reading about the game. There's other scenes like this where basically you kind of have to trial and error it and find the right area and die, and then and then you try again. Which unfortunately co-ops the exact thing that it's trying to force you into, which is avoiding death.
Right.
So
Because
that's
that's
sort
the
of
like that's the tension, right? Like that's the
yeah,
thing
sure.
that they're threatening you with is I'll take away your life, I'll take away your life, and then you literally have to do that. Like
Right,
so in the one hand, like it's really scary in the moment because like, oh my gosh, I don't want to die, but I'm having to, run up
right,
to this guy with a club so I can hit that one
right,
switch. But
right.
eventually, yeah, that wears off. And just I felt like mentioning this earlier, but in case you think me and Greg are just pulling stuff out of a hat for this whole like death wearing off thing, I mean, this is literally how you you treat phobias in therapy. Like you expose people to what they're afraid of, and it becomes less scary.
Yeah,
It's the most effective treatment. So
yep.
if you continually expose people
Pretty much
to
the only one actually.
right, if you continually expose people to the fear of dying in a video game, guess what? It gets less scary. Like
Yep.
psychologically, there's no way around that.
Yeah, yeah. It's just kind of adaptation. But the interesting thing is, well, there's many interesting things. But so if you fall into that trap, kind of as a game in design, where you're using the very thing, because like there's still like at that point. So for us in playing Outlast, we were so scared and we were exhausted at that point too,
Right.
that we opted into dying. Dying was actually sounded great for the moment.
Yeah.
We didn't have the full survival mechanism of, and so there's some level where like you said, you're right at the beginning. Of course, like the if a game can naturally kind of create the sense of being chased, that is scary, and that if you can make your player experience that sucks. But at the end of the chase, if there's nothing to be scared of at the end of it, then that just kind of becomes more frustrating than scary, and
Right.
so that becomes a very interesting problem. Is how do you give your player a fail state, and keep it even with death based, without sucking away that over and over again, and
Yeah.
so
Sucking
we have
away
a
the
few examples
tension.
here to talk about in terms of how different games do that, and what kind of can be at stake other than just the fear of death, which is interesting too. Which because like think about like Mark our last playthrough, um, going into that early on, the very very beginning, right? I was terrified. I think you were pretty scared,
Yep.
and in the first 10 minutes of the game, I didn't assume that I was going to die. Right, like actually, I wasn't expecting to have a really gruesome death really early on. I figured it was going to be a bunch of scary things. So
Right.
like I was far more scared of scary things happening than than dying
Right.
actually, which is really telling. That's I mean that's could be because I've just been watching a horror movie too. That's how movies work, right? Movies
Right.
can't give you a fail state. The movie won't end. They just have to continually scare you and count on you getting scared. And movies fall into the same trap, of course. That's more expectation based. But anyway, so back to death. Want to go through some of the things that we found in terms of ways to punish a character other than killing them, which sounds really sadistic. We're not like trying to.
Trying
uh,
to. Yes, we're trying to make
trying to
death.
find
We want
actual
to make
fates worse than
them.
deaths.
Yeah, they
Definitely.
want to make the players wish they were dead.
We're solving a
Uh,
gameplay problem.
yeah, exactly. Uh, no, I think that's a good point you bring up though about how you were afraid of things even though you didn't think you were going to die necessarily in the beginning.
Right.
Um, but I think when you continue to escalate those horrific things, like I think threatening with death becomes an important part of that.
It
And
eventually has to be too. Yeah.
right, you have something does eventually have to be a risk.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right.
So one game that I think I particularly like the way that they do death, and it is in fact a death, but is Slender.
All
Um,
right.
in that game, there's no sound basically in the entire game. It's very quiet, and when you encounter Slender, you start to hear this louder sort of staticky high-pitched whine, I guess. It's hard to describe. You can look up footage of Slender if you want to hear the noise. But that gets worse and worse as Slender gets close to you.
Yep.
And your vision starts to blur, and you start to see like flashes of his face and things that are pretty like, you definitely want to get out of that situation.
Yeah.
And
Viscerally scary.
right, and you can, which I think is brilliant
Mm-hmm.
because the game can threaten you with death without actually having to deliver.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's a good point. It's actually very hard to do. Like we got hit in Outlast, and like there was blood on our screen, but that was gonna go away.
right,
Um, there was no getting hit wasn't scarier. It's kind of like a binary, either you're there or not.
right.
You're either dead or you're not dead. Like getting the process of getting more dead wasn't scarier. Slender is the
No,
opposite. You have to go through this whole process every time you're about to get to the fail state, and it is legitimately really just unnerving. It's really simple. It's just it's loud noises. It's flickering movements and a scary image flashing. Really simple stuff, but really effective.
yeah, well, you'll notice everything that you just described there are things that a game can deliver on, right? Like
Yeah.
a game does have access when you're playing a game to what you're hearing and what you're seeing.
Hmm.
And it has no access to what you're feeling bodily. And so when you get
Right.
struck in Outlast, we've already talked about this, it falls short. In Slender, they use their strengths, which is, hey, we have their eyeballs and we have their
Right.
ears.
Right.
And so we can play these terrible noises and show them these, creepy images, and they'll
Hmm.
want to avoid that.
Yeah.
Um, and that's
And that's
great. I think
Yeah,
it's
and
very
that's
effective.
exactly that's cool. It matches up even with the fantasy of Slenderman, which is he usually Slenderman stories when they started weren't about like violent death. It actually almost never details how he kills or what happens to people. It's very ethereal fear. You either go insane or just disappear. So I think it's clever that you don't have this gruesome, horrible, stabby death. You just see him fully and have this horrible sensory experience, which is exactly kind of what the game or the story is supposed to promise.
Hmm.
And Slender is interesting too because it's something that you are like outside of the fact that it's and I think all of these things, just like anything, like you said with phobia, is just fear in general. If you do enough of any of this stuff, in theory, any fear can be overcome.
Right.
So just yeah, exposure over time will desensitize you. But even if you watch people play Slender, like you never get over like yeah, you'll be stop being shocked by like the first time that you get that game over state and it's kind of this fourth wall breaking thing, right? Like your whole screen you don't see your character die, your screen begins to flash and you lose control of it, and then the Slenderman faces your whole screen and it's this loud noise. And then it gives you the game over screen. Um, you don't really have like this entire feeling of death. It's more this like failed. It's this the kind of barrage of the senses, and that is very that's and because it's you don't have that permanently. That's a lot harder to adapt to than the fear of it. So I think you're less like scared in the moment because you know what's happening. The expectation's gone, but there's something that just can't replace the pain of loud noises and flashing horrible images.
Right.
And that is really it. Really makes you. It's definitely worth outside of just beating the game. You want to avoid that happening.
Yeah, as it from like a game that is pretty sensorily tame. Like
Exactly.
there's nothing really happen. Like I said, there's not much sound. You have like a flashlight. It's like a wood. You're
There's
outside.
three buttons, right? You can walk, run, and turn on a flashlight.
Right. So like there's not much happening on the screen, but then,
Yeah.
when you start getting terrorized by Slender, like the screen flashes in like white colors, which is in a
Yeah.
massive contrast to the black
To all the
around.
darkness. Yeah.
The sound, ramps way up and gets loud. So like this grating contrast, like you said, I
Right.
think forces you away from death in a way that's allows the death to remain more scary because you're not doing it over and over again because you want to avoid it.
And another note with Slender, the interesting thing with him is like that's another game that is super heavy on the expectation, right? In terms of you actually, the story of the system in Slenderman, how it got started, the
I
glitch
did.
from
Yeah,
Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. That's we're actually running low on time here. I want to keep going. But look up the story of Slender and the system of how they made Slender kind of appear out of nowhere. It was a glitch from a Sherlock Holmes game where they forgot to code uh, any animation for Watson movement. So
Right.
the game would think that he was moving, but if you kept on looking at him, it wouldn't change until you looked away, and then if you look again, then the game would re-render his. He'd be able to just teleport very eerily to wherever you were, as long as you weren't looking at him, which is exactly what Slenderman does. So, um, anyway, all that to say that system of you see him and there's no when you see him, there's no huge pop or scare. He's just there, and you have to take a second to put together that he's there, and then the stuff starts happening.
Right.
So it's this very clever kind of priming effect that happens. Let's see what else we got. Um, we talked a little bit about the sanity and amnesia in
We,
terms of just making things scarier.
I'll talk about Until Dawn for a little bit.
Oh yeah,
Um,
do that.
One of the things that, well, so for those who don't know, Until Dawn is sort of marketed as a choose your own adventure horror film. You get to, decide who splits off from the group and does something stupid, and all that, all the classic things that happen in horror films. You get to do through a game, and one of the ways that Until Dawn remains scary is because you aren't you aren't going to die. Like, you're the narrator. So you can send. I think you might be able to kill literally every character if you play the game in a particular way.
Yeah,
And
I'm not sure.
so you have these permanent consequences. Like, death is very much a part of what's happening in the game. It's just not death to you. And so it still remains horrific and scary and consequential, but you aren't having the player just sort of reset and replay the same scenarios over and over again, because the story always continues forward even after a particular character dies.
Right. Which is really interesting in terms of I think almost every game we've talked about so far, minus Dead Space, is first person.
Hmm.
And in you're kind of more a director almost in Until Dawn, right? I think you're still controlling characters, but you are, because you're not just one of them, you're all of them. You are kind of more this third character, right? This kind of like the third party sort of thing,
Right.
which is a very different feel. So like when one of them dies, it's a different experience as a player than like the game's not trying to convince you that you're dying, right? It's not trying to
Right.
give you the experience of death, which is, like we said, really really hard to do effectively. Instead, you have this cost to, it's this more kind of abstract social thing. You have this social cost. You have this, suddenly you have less resources, suddenly you have less things to work with, and have lost something, and as opposed to, and also because the game keeps on going, right? Like when a character dies, the game can continue without that
Right.
character. So you actually are still playing. You had a fail state, or you didn't have an entire fail state. The game didn't have to reset itself, but you lost something.
Right.
So there is like weight to
And
those.
possibly
That's a
something you cared about. Like,
right,
again, this is the game giving you something so that it can take it away. Like, it will introduce you to, James, and have you flesh out his character and have him, do different things. And then it will threaten James' life. And you're like, oh, shoot, I like care about this.
right,
Because the
right,
game kind of gave you this story to buy into. And then
right.
that becomes something that is a vulnerability now because you care
Which I
about it.
wonder. I wonder if that like kind of gets more into psychological horror in some ways, right? Rather than, I mean, I guess it's still survival because that the game is just about a killer like trying to kill people, and you're trying to just kind of get through it. But the way it does that, right? The way it like sneaks into your brain and the things it messes with is a little bit more abstract than that kind of. We've been talking probably a little bit more like very visceral, very
Right.
heavy, and because I think the things to take away other than death that we've been talking about, other than Slender, tend to be more in that realm, actually more abstract,
Yeah.
because games just can't do
Can't kill
that
you.
horribly viscerally over and
Right.
over again, right?
Right.
The other one was uh, Resident Evil 7, which this is a new game, so spoilers for anyone. I haven't played it. I just have done some research on it, um, and uh, and they have a really cool system. Which again, spoilers alert for people who haven't played the game and want to. Don't spoil yourself for this because it sounds really cool. So full stop. All right, here we go. Basically, there's several states in the game where you can die, you can get killed by one of the antagonists, or you can lose. You can have a fail state, but he won't kill you. He'll actually drag you back to a room, and give you the chance to survive. He'll cut off your leg and then give you a chance to heal yourself and then start the chase again. And even in that, you can actually still bleed out. You can choose to not heal yourself. You can fail that part, or sometimes they'll just kill you straight up. So like we said, the expectation part goes away there when you have actually a random, not only a random death like Dead Space does, where you have these horrible, gruesome death animations that you can't skip, um, but they are now randomized if you're even going to die or not. And just imagine that first time where you get, you maybe failed this area once or twice and you died, and then the third time he takes you and you're still alive and you can still control your character. Um, that sounds horrible. That sounds
Right.
terrifying. Much less not knowing which one it's going to be every time. And you can't just like restart if he decides to let you live. You can't opt out of that scenario. Like when you die, you're done, and then you get to just restart. You have to play through this kind of torture slash like decision to make to continue playing. And
Right. You don't even have
I
like
think it's
full.
brilliant. That's a fantastic idea.
You don't even have full control over like how you're going to die at that point, right?
Right, it's not even a known quantity anymore.
Exactly. And so you're kept alive, and then yeah, you really can't fail for a little bit. Like you're in this, the game got more horrible and you're stuck in it.
Right,
And that's what it punishes you with other than death is like
right,
now you've got to live through this other scene that was you didn't even have to go through this, but now since
right.
you messed up, you do.
Yeah, and that would give you high impetus to not get caught by that guy anymore. Like if you're playing the game, right? Like I would not feel good about stopping and letting myself die like I did not last if I knew
Right.
that that potentially would lead me into another worse scenario. Which is I think it's fantastic. I think it's great. Um, I'm surprised that in some ways I'm surprised that I mean I wouldn't have never thought of that, so maybe that's not so surprising that it took this long. But that is a great thing about games in that you have a lot of narrative kind of wherewithal to go different directions that you can't do in a movie, and giving alternate ways to react to certain situations outside of like the player, but having NPCs act differently is really cool.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of mentioned Dead Space does this slightly. Dead Space is kind of in another kind of like near Slender ish, and kind of like with Resident Evil, where when you die, you get this. This was actually kind of a big deal at the time. It was unique in that each enemy has multiple death animations for you if they kill you, and you have to watch your character get eviscerated in these various horrible, gruesome ways by the necromorphs. And they're very creative. They're very gory. And they're very unpleasant. Actually, they're not fun to watch. Actually, think like a Mortal Kombat fatality times like two, and then have to do that over and over again. So there is a level of when you die in Dead Space. And Dead Space is different because it is combat based, right? It's not survival. It's well, it's that's it's not fully combat. It's not like Fear, where it's like a first person shooter. It's kind of at a line where you still have that like never feel like you have too many resources, and you're just trying to get by. But there's a lot of the main dynamic gameplay mechanic is killing the necromorphs rather than
Right.
hiding from them. So Death Space is kind of that in between, but it's cool because I think the scare for death then becomes. It wouldn't make as much sense to try to do something psychological with Dead Space because you're not really in that mindset. You're kind of more in this me against them mentality, and that's actually what you do. You dismember the enemies as opposed to like shooting them. You have to cut off their limbs. Um, before they cut off yours. And if you fail at that, then you get to see as well. It's unskippable. It's like I said, it's loud, it's visceral, and I remember playing through it, and the scares generally decreasing as time went on. But I remember always never being happy about dying, never being like, never just letting myself die to restart an area.
Right.
I would use the menu for that, or I would really try to avoid death as long as I could because it's again it's just kind of this visceral thing like Slender where you don't want to watch that.
No, exactly.
And especially with different enemy types, it gets so uh, they're new ones over and over again. So it's not you're not able to completely always know exactly what's going to come. Like, oh, how's this thing going to absolutely destroy me?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, it seems like there's a theme of like it's effective to give the player things about the death that they would want to avoid, and
right,
then it to as much as you possibly can without taking away the disempowering nature of a horror game. Give them the resources to avoid that death,
right,
because like that is your tension builder. So as long as they can, it's funny because the player thinks that they're succeeding by avoiding dying, but actually they're building tension for themselves by doing that. I guess if you can always get away, like again, you kind of get desensitized to it.
Right.
So I really don't envy people who try to make horror games because
Yeah,
it's
man, it sounds like there's
so
a lot of
difficult.
really, really narrow lines you got to walk with horror games as opposed to. I mean, that's probably true for balance and power in other games, but like, I feel like this is a really, really difficult one, more so than your average RPG or action game, um,
Yeah,
where
you're
you really have to, because it's not just like the gameplay experience of like if you can beat the game or not. It's like you're always dealing with the emotional state of the player, period,
exactly.
and that's such a fine-tuned thing.
Yeah, well, we talked in the Dead Space, or sorry, the Left 4 Dead episode about the game director and how it has a quantity for the stress of each player, and
Oh yeah,
it really tries to maximize that, or have them go up and down in a sinusoidal sort of way, where
yeah,
it's uh, you never feel like you're in a steady state because the game doesn't want you to be there. It wants you to always be either, okay, catch your breath and then ramp it up again, and then catch your breath and then ramp it up again. I think you've got to have this alternating sequence in a
yeah.
horror game because you can't just always full blast horror on somebody.
So for all that is to say, for how difficult horror games seem to be to make, and with zero game design experience for Mark or I, uh, what do you think is we're really good at posing problems and picking things apart, but it's also really important to actually pose solutions. So I mean, I think
Right.
my favorite of the solutions for death was the Resident Evil idea, was thinking about that system made more. It'd be probably very resource intensive, but the idea of having death not always respond the same way, and not just in terms of like killed differently, but actually changing the game state differently. Um,
Right.
I think that's brilliant. Um, Otherwise, it seems like kind of a core mechanic thing where like if the mechanic of the game, like in Outlast, was like it's first person, no combat, so you pretty much can only solve puzzles. And if the mechanic is basically learning an area, and that's the way that you are going to solve the puzzle, then the only way to do that is kind of trial and error. So it might just be kind of more of a core design thing too. Like I don't know if there's a great way to do that with a game whose mechanic is trying to learn an area and still have death be something difficult to avoid, or exploration.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like it does seem like a pretty core problem to the game, to the genre. Um, I think my suggestion would be I have a couple. One would be to take a page out of horror films, which do a good job of having uh, I guess, intervals of fear followed by breaks in the
Sure.
fear, um, or at least where the fear isn't quite so present. And a lot of ways, a lot of the times, the way they do this is by interjecting some, hopeless romance or some,
Comic relief.
some comedy, something that lightens the mood for a little bit before you hit them again with the fear and the terror.
Right.
And so I think
It
that is
it does a
something I
really good job.
haven't seen done to like a great effect in a game. Nothing's coming to mind at the moment, at least. And so you can stop playing the game, and then you do kind of get that fear break, and then you can come back into it. But if the game itself like regulated
Right.
that would be really interesting. I would be so fascinated by a system in a game that after it had determined it hit you with enough, somehow like either gave you a dream sequence or like something that wasn't quite so horrific,
Yeah.
and then you came back to the horror part of the game,
Yeah.
and that would be really interesting.
Well, there's actually there's an interesting opportunity for that coming up with, well, just as technology increases. But I saw I didn't actually get to watch too much of it with sound because I think I was somewhere where I didn't have headphones. But I saw Day Nine played a game that kept track of he. I mean, this is obviously like pretty far future here, but it was a friend of his who had developed a game that responded to your heart rate. Actually, he would wear EEG monitors or electrodes, and the game kept track of his pulse, and then adapted to that. So it's kind of like what you're talking about with the Left 4 Dead system of stress, but
Right.
even more so,
Much more accurate.
which is also terrifying because that's we can already do that pretty darn well without having direct data and designing a system that actually responded to how you're doing, as well as like finding some way to, like you said, kind of maximize the difference between always being on, like, and not hitting that state that we got to, right, where we're just like, I need to be done, like I can't, I
Right.
don't want to, I don't want to do this. Um, Another one would be making death having other things to take away other than death, like we talked
Yeah.
about with Until
That was
Dawn.
the other
So
thing I thought of.
having other characters that you're responsible for,
Yeah.
and having the game continue if you lose them.
And like if you had a point in the game where like instead of just hitting you with more horrific things, they could up the ante on the thing that the game was threatening to take away. Like
Right.
imagine if instead you go through some horrific sequence, you're scared, it's bad, but then you get this break where you learn more about the love story between this couple, and you're like, they're threatening the life of your significant other, and so like you get more attached to the thing the game is threatening to take away from you. That could up the stakes.
Yeah, and or even like even mechanically, the potential for, and this you have to be a little more careful with this, but fine tuning would be really difficult. But losing if you like lose a hand in an encounter, and then suddenly we have one less equip slot, or you
Hmm.
use objects less effectively, or basically introducing an injury system where you can get injured and that will affect you, but not entirely killed, and then making death actually very difficult to achieve. Um,
Right.
so that you always are feeling weight. And it's interesting, these things that we're maintaining actually still, I think, get more into what we're going to talk about next week, which is just the psychological aspect of horror. We're talking about, like you said, kind of this lack of visceralness that survival can't really do, right? Because the game isn't going to actually kill you. So I wonder if like a
Right.
true survival game, which is like you said about avoiding death, you kind of have to overlap some of the punishment with some psychological aspects in order to actually keep it entirely um, kosher in some ways. Keep it moving, keep it scary. Um,
Yeah. I think it's a
so
good point.
so it
Like,
might be that
yeah.
different genres of horror combined are really the most effective type. So we think we're going to end actually with just a discussion on briefly my favorite scene from The Dark Descent, which again, slight spoilers. Game's like 6 years old now. But if you haven't played it and want to play it, definitely don't listen to this part because this is the best part. And it kind of goes into our conversation in terms of we were talking about like desensitization and priming and the ability for games to kind of highlight what they're gonna take from you, give you something, and then take it, and so on. And the scene is, for anyone who's played it, the notorious water scene where you are in an area of the mansion that's flooded. Um, and you're not underwater; you can walk in it, but and in it is an unknown creature that seems to be very dangerous. It's referred to as a kraken. Appears to be bipedal in that you can just see its footprints in the water as it moves. It just splashes. And the whole sequence is just trying to get out of the area without, if you're in the water, it knows where you are, and the footsteps will come towards you, and it will kill you if it reaches you. So the whole sequence is jumping between some platforming, jumping between boxes and floating things, distracting it with books or meat. If you use meat, then it'll eat, and you'll get a few more seconds of safety. And so the brilliant part about this, one, just the experience of the fact that you don't see the thing at all, and that makes it way more terrifying than if it was a scary monster. I maintain that entirely. Two, tapping into really deep traumatic fears of like water. Mark and I were briefly talking about water horror and how that's like a thing, right? Um, how water has a very kind of primal instinctual fear in humans, but also it's unknowable. It's unpierceable. We know it's far easier to look into space, and we know more about the surface of the moon than the oceans. Right? It's very actually hard to see what's down there. There's a very kind of primal fear amongst in with water for whatever reason, and literally just in the game, if you fall into the water and you can hear the footsteps, you're probably not turned to look at it. But there's this incredible panic that starts. It's just like get out of the water, get out of the water, get out, like out. I need to be out of the water, like no matter what. Even without the monster, it would feel that way. And so anyway, so the whole sequence is this give and take between. Most of the time, there are these parts where it's not entirely safe to get through, or you can kind of fall in a little bit, and then you'll have to get onto something else before it catches you. But the very end is It's just one doorway, one hallway with the door at the end, and it's long, and that's it. And it's flooded still, and there's nothing to jump on. There's the only way to do it is to distract it, get it far enough away, and then jump in the water and just sprint to the end and open the door, screaming, and then close the door, and have it chase you. And that is one of the, by far the most memorable part of the game for me, at least. It's interesting because it achieved something that was fascinating in that, like, yeah, once the initial shock of like the water, it's very you very quickly understand, the anticipation goes down. You very quickly understand what's happening and what can happen, and the sequence stays scary no matter what. It's a sequence that's not very scary to watch, and it's very, very scary to play. Kind of goes back to that, like, you're from a place of safety, then decide you will go into a place of non-safety. That moment's really hard. The really cool thing is the fact that they force you into the water, not at the beginning, but at the very end, where they spent all this time and energy, this 15-minute sequence of the game, convincing you and reinforcing and making you experience the fact that water is bad, and being in the water is just cognitively anathema, right? Just, you cannot exist in the water. Do not be in the water. And they spend all this time doing that, and then the last thing, they go, like, get in the water.
Right.
Which is just brutal. So as opposed to, if that was the very first sequence, where they, like, dropped you into it, and then, you know, you're looking around, you're like, oh crap, I'm, like, getting chased, I have to run, you run down the hallway, and it's really scary, and then you play the rest of the sequence, that would be really scary for the moment, but it just pales in comparison to that moment where you're standing on the box and looking down and know this is what you have to do, and then the rush and experiencing, hearing just the water slapping as you're moving, and the footprints as you've been being terrorized by this thing for the past, you know, however long it took you to do the sequence, is so much more powerful there than anywhere else. So I think it's just really fascinating that the game can both, like, desensitize you to some extent, but also have more power in the ability to prime you to convince you of something and then force it on you again.
Right. It gave you a sense of safety by avoiding the water, and then by taking away the ability to avoid water, it takes away this perceived, like, control over your safety, right?
Yeah.
Because I can't stay on the boxes now. Like, I'm not safe. This is not safe, and it's terrifying.
It's a brilliant sequence. Like I said, I remember watching it actually before I played it, and I knew the whole sequence, and when I played it, it was still deeply upsetting. Like, it's really jarring, and there's no gore, there's nothing, no horrifying imagery, and it's one of the scariest sequences I've ever done. So, and it's interesting, just to bring it back all the way back here, for death in that one, if you get hit, you just die, and you have to restart. And so it's exactly what we're talking about, is this kind of, like, that's not the ideal, right? But for some reason, I don't know, that scene just seems to have a pass in my mind, where it doesn't matter how many times you die, you still don't want to get friggin' caught in the water by that thing. Even though there's no horrible animation, there's no, you don't lose anything, you just restart, and it's the same again. But yeah, that, for whatever reason, that one was really resilient to like, adaptation. Maybe that was just me. I don't know, but
Cool. Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to end our discussion for today. Next week, we are going to be focusing a lot more on the psychological horror elements. We hope to be done with our playthrough of Doki Doki Literature Club, which is, we're told, a psychological horror game, and I can see it a little bit based on where we're at right now. I'm hoping it becomes a bit more overt.
Yeah. So. This would be the most, like, subtle is not even the right word. Like, if this continues to this level of subtlety, this is not art. That is.
Yes.
Require a heavy imagination.
Exactly. At that point, it's more just like,
I'm all for subtlety, actually, in games. I love that, but this is pushing it.
Yeah, it's almost like if you weren't looking, it's like a Rorschach test. It's like if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't have seen it. Like,
oh my God, no, we just read poetry for 2.5 hours.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're hoping it gets worse, and then we can talk about it, and we have some points to make on psychological horror, which can draw from that experience. But until next time, we hope you're all having a spooky October. We certainly are. So.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We'll see you next week.
All right. See you guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.